Maybe it's working. It says going live. All right. Hello, and welcome to the first event in our now third annual Diverse Perspectives in Digital Media and Design speaker series. To paraphrase James Baldwin, nothing can be changed until it is faced. And this is certainly true of the inequities that have historically shaped the entertainment industry and digital media, both on screen and behind the scenes. This event is brought to you by UConn's Department of Digital Media and Design. We'd like to begin today's event by acknowledging that the land that we gather here in Storrs, Connecticut, is the territory of the Mohegan, Mashatunket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Pagooset, Nipmuc, and Lenape peoples who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We thank them for the resilience and strength in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. Today's event will feature an hour of conversation, including questions from the virtual audience. And we will feature today our conversation with our guest speaker, Aalok Kanani, followed by a Q&A featuring questions from the virtual audience. Please take advantage of that YouTube chat box during this presentation, and we will try to answer any of your questions during the discussion. I'm Heather Elliott Familaro, and I'm a digital artist and filmmaker, and most importantly, the department head for digital media and design at the University of Connecticut. DMD is a young department founded in 2013, which has rapidly grown to over 375 undergrads and graduate students and 26 full-time faculty. We have 7 undergraduate concentrations across a full spectrum of digital media, from film production, animation, interactivity, business, and the humanities, both in the Storrs and Stanford campuses. In our department, we value and celebrate our students' diverse backgrounds, and we support their development both as individuals and as professional media creators. The Diverse Perspectives in Digital Media and Design speaker series is one celebration of these shared values. So now on to the show. It is my extreme pleasure to welcome today's co-host, Professor Clarissa Seglio, and DMD Digital Media Business Strategy student, Marie Sachs, and DMD Digital Media Business Strategy student, Caleb Eastman. So Clarissa Seglio is a U.S. cultural historian trained in the interdisciplinary field of American studies, who works at the intersection of museum studies, public history, and digital humanities. Much of her research focuses on the roles that artifacts, material, visual, and digital, play in constructing national and social imaginaries within the context of museum work. Her book, A Cultural Arsenal for Democracy, the World War II Work of U.S. Museums, published by University of Massachusetts Press in 2022, traces how from the 1930s through to the intermediate post-war years, the fledgling ideal of the museum as a social instrument active in current affairs led to new modes of storytelling through exhibition craft. Through her teaching and research, Seglio also collaborates with museums, libraries, and communities on interdisciplinary public-facing projects that engage diverse audiences in topics of contemporary concern. So,
thank you, Heather. I'm so delighted that we're kicking off this season with such an important and sadly still very timely topic.
And Clarissa, did you want to go ahead and introduce Caleb and Mari?
Absolutely. Mari Sachs is a senior in DMD's Business Strategy concentration. Sorry, I'm hearing some noise in the background. All right, let me take that from the top. Mari is a senior in the DMD program's business strategy concentration. She balances a full course load of academic work with competition, practices, and training sessions while competing on the women's rowing team. She worked as a social media marketing intern for ComScore during the past summer, using both quantitative and qualitative data, as well as data patterns to create visual stories. Hey, Mari.
Thank you. So happy to be here. Sorry, I forgot I was on mute.
No worries. A hazard of Zoom that everyone watching can relate to. Also, I'd like to introduce Caleb Eastman, a senior in our business strategies concentration. He works for the athletics department here at UConn as a videographer and creative video editor. He's also working on TV production for UConn's basketball games. Go Huskies. Hey, Caleb.
Hey, excited to be here. Thank you.
And now I'd like to welcome our guest for today, Aalok Kanani, whose talk, Invisible Asians, How Underrepresentation Creates Otherization and Fuels Hate, is, as I mentioned, devastatingly timely. Aalok is the Chief Digital and Communications Officer at the Asia Society, a global nonprofit headquartered in New York City. Previously, he's held senior digital and marketing roles on the Biden-Harris general election campaign, Mayor Pete Buttigieg's primary campaign in the Obama administration, and at the United Nations. And he has also worked in the private sector at Lyft, startups in the US and India, and, as if that all weren't enough, also as a public strategy consultant. We'll be pasting some links into the chat so that you can get to learn more about him. And at this point, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Great to be with all of you. And thank you, Clarissa, Caleb, Mari, and Heather for that excellent intro. I'm happy to kick things off and just talk a little bit about me and where I come from. And I think that'll also explain why I picked the topic I did for today's talk, which has most to do with my most recent and my current role. But it all makes sense. So great to be with you all. My name is Aalok Kanani. Like has been said, I'm currently the Chief Digital and Communications Officer at the Asia Society, but before that have had a career largely in politics and government, and largely as a digital director, which means all sorts of things. You will see that. But so I started my journey, my professional journey, obviously, as an undergrad. I went to Tufts, and actually, I was getting my degree, my BFA, in conjunction with my BA originally in photography. I went to college to become a photographer. Ideally a photojournalist, but I didn't know what yet. But I knew a photographer. So I was getting my BFA and my BA in college. And then I got swept up working for the Obama campaign, and that kind of set me on a totally different path, the path I'm on now. And early on, I decided, okay, I think I can do everything I want as a photographer without potentially the BFA. But maybe let me double down on this path in politics. And so I ended up diverting, got away from the digital media world. Didn't realize we brought back in one day, but pursued politics. During college, had a number of internships in that realm. Starting with the Obama campaign, then working for other political campaigns, NGOs, and nonprofits. After college, I went to DC to work for the Obama administration. That's one of those nepotism plus good luck jobs you can get. Happy to talk more about how that happened, but set me on this path of politics and policy and government, but nothing at all touching digital and digital media and content. And what actually, so I spent 2 years kind of as the assistant to someone fancy in DC at the education department, did my time, picked up lots of dry cleaning and lunch. And then 2 years later, after President Obama won re-election, because I happened to be the young person, and this was 2012. At that time, just being young meant you were qualified for digital jobs. And so just being the young person, they said, hey, we need someone to run digital at the United States mission to the UN, essentially our country's embassy to the UN. That's not a job they give to 24-year-olds anymore, but at the time they did. And so I learned how to do all this stuff, really started on the job. and totally accidentally. It wasn't that I was seeking out a job in digital media. It's just that was the opportunity, and I took it. From then, I went on to work at the UN, which was mentioned. I left the administration to work for the UN's Ebola mission, also doing digital stuff. At this point, I was squarely entrenched in the world, and my title started to increasingly become just digital director. So I was doing digital stuff there, also worked as a photographer for the UN, then went on to be a consultant for a while, which I couldn't recommend less. I'm happy to talk about that, but got great experience. In 2016, I went to grad school and left, and that was my departure from this world of politics and government, and all that. I went to grad school to study business, and I thought, okay, I've learned this world of digital media and content, and how can I apply it to the private sector? Instead, the 2016 election happened, and so I spent my 2 years in grad school really thinking about, oh man, I got to get back in the arena. And so after grad school, I spent a little bit of time in the private sector, but then quickly jumped on the 2020 cycle, and ran the digital teams for Mayor Pete, and then the nominee, now President Biden. And since then, I have been doing things that are a little bit less intense. And so I spent a year in tech, which was kind of a long goal of mine, but it wasn't for me for lots of reasons, which I'm also happy to talk about. My private sector since have been short-lived because I've often found that I don't get enough meaning out of them. And then for the last year, I've been in my current role at the Asia Society. So that's me. And how does that get to our topic for today? A couple of important pieces. So in 2020, I was working, like I said, on the Biden campaign, and 2020 was also when we saw this huge spike in violence and hate and discrimination against Asian Americans. And at the time, we thought it was largely due to COVID, knew it was largely due to the pandemic and xenophobia around attributing it to Asian Americans, Chinese Americans. But also it was, and I'm being political here, but in my opinion, at least, driven by the other side. I was working on the Biden campaign, and we saw the Republican side at the time really fueling a lot of this hate. And so it became part of our job on the Biden campaign to try and counter it. At least to some degree, it became this big political issue for us of how can we be the party that stands up for Asian Americans. But then I also quickly realized there isn't a ton of political value to speaking out for Asian Americans. Even as someone senior up on the Biden campaign who was in charge of all our content, I ran a team of about 120 people in charge of every single piece of content we put out. Even to me, it was clear, we don't need to be shining a light on this issue. We don't need to be telling stories of Asian Americans to win the election. It's a small population, and this problem doesn't matter. And so that really stuck with me after the campaign ended. And then I kind of thought in the back of my head, well, it'd be really great to have a role one day more focused on these issues of the AAPI community. And then lo and behold, about a year later, I got this great opportunity at the Asia Society, and I took this role for two big reasons. One is the Asia Society was undergoing a rebuild to figure out how it pivots to digital. It's a really old organization that does a lot of old organization things, and I was trying to figure out how to pivot to digital. But at the same time, it's an organization that, quite frankly, is founded for white people, for an audience of white people, but about Asia and Asians. And it was and is being really intentional about changing that. How can it be an organization that both strategically, but also for kind of mission-driven reasons, speaks to Asians more, creates more content featuring Asians, and celebrates Asians more? And specifically, we've we've made it a core pillar of ours to do more to stand up against Asian hate and platform Asians. So all that said, I was very excited to join the organization and be part of that. And then a few months into my tenure here, I came across the most recent TAF status index report, which I shared in relation ahead of my lecture here today. And that report had this really, really surprising finding. Actually, let's put up those slides now that I'm to that point. I put together some slides, perfect. And so this report, which came out in 2022, had this really, really interesting finding that actually hate and discrimination and general bad sentiment to Asians and Asian Americans in America has actually increased between 2020 and 2022. And that's despite decreasing COVID. That's despite political polarization and kind of the active president talking, fueling hate. That's despite a downturn the lack of downturn in the economy. The economy was in pretty bad straits during the pandemic and is doing much better now. So despite all of these things that we attributed as the reason for the rising hate, it's actually increased. And so, could we go to the next slide, please? And so there's some interesting specific stats. So one, the increase in percentage of Americans who attributed COVID-19 to Asian Americans. Some of that was because of racist names being attributed to it. Some of it was also because of legitimate news stories, like investigation of how it originated, understanding that it did really come from a lab in China, but for whatever reason, there was an increase for that reason. Next slide. And this, which I thought was more startling, which is there was a sharp increase just over 1 year in the percentage of Americans who kind of believe that Asians and Asian Americans are not loyal to the US or more loyal to their country of origin in the US. And that's not because there's this massive, there's not a third more Asian immigrants last year or anything like that. It's just a change in sentiment. Next slide, please. So it's that trend of increasing kind of otherization of Asians, coupled with the fact that Asians continue not to be represented in media. So we talk a lot about Asians in movies and TV. And I think this is a very interesting stat. Oh, I lost part of it, but essentially this slide says we see, one, Asians are underrepresented compared to any other group. We just don't see them on media and content. But when they are, they're portrayed in really harmful ways. Next slide, please. And so it's not all harmful. Some of it is, the Asian scientist or really good at math, really smart. Some of that is definitely true, the kind of model minority type of stereotypes, but a lot of it is also really, really negative, particularly around Asian women. There's a high degree of sexualization, of violent portrayals of otherization, which is easier, which makes kind of violent portrayals easier, of course. So that was a really worrisome trend. Next slide, please. So there's this trend of Asians are, there's growing negative sentiment towards Asians amongst Americans. There's this trend of Asians continue to not be represented in media and content. And then there's this new trend, which I think is obvious to most of us, but especially the students in the room, but this new trend of we are increasingly getting our information about other ethnic and racial groups from content, from TV, music, movies, yes, and the news, but really we're consuming TV, music, news, all of those things more from social media. And that's the biggest delta here. Social media is increasingly driving, and in social content is driving how we see other racial groups. And so this area where Asians are totally unrepresented or badly represented is shaping how we see Asians, and the kind of problem becomes clear of why otherization is being caused. next slide. I don't know if that's the last one. It might be the last one. Oh, and so here's how Asian society comes in. That's relevant. So we have made it our mission to take on this problem. And we see it really as an opportunity challenge. So the challenge I've walked through, right? This rise of anti-Asian hate, despite the decrease of COVID and all these other things. And the opportunity is really, in addition to the fact that, Asians are not being represented and the opportunities to represent them. I think the bigger opportunity is the fact that Asians are now such a large portion of our population, of diaspora populations, of the population in America and Europe and places like that, right? When the Asian Society was founded 50 years ago, there was less than 1 million Asians, and now there's 25x that. So huge growth. But then also, if we think about how we get through to fighting anti-Asian hate, I think the biggest opportunity is that community. How do we get through that community? Because they are the best ambassadors for showing the positive impact Asian Americans have in American society. So we are dedicated to that. We're in the early stages of that, but that's why I wanted to talk about that today. I think that's all the slides. So now I'll turn it over to questions. And I do want to note, happy to talk about, I think probably, if I'm being fair, the more interesting parts of my story are things that I'm not currently working on. So happy to talk about 2020 campaign, the administration stuff, to my time in college and how I got where I am today. But turn it over to you all.
Thank you so much for that. The first question I have is, was there ever a time, like when you were in college, when politics and photography got mixed up and you felt like you had to choose between one or the other?
Absolutely. So when I was in college, freshman year, I was doing this dual degree of getting a degree in political science and also my BFA in fine art photography. And I also decided I wanted to work for the Obama campaign. And that's when I had to make a choice. It was really, the Obama campaign said, we need you 30 hours a week. And I was trying to get 2 degrees and it was too much. So at that point, I had to decide. And the decision for me was actually pretty easy because I was doing so much photography on campus. Like I was working for the school newspaper, I was working for the school, I was finding other outlets to develop that art. And I didn't think I needed the classroom experience. And then it actually ended up dovetailing really well because in pretty much every job I had, especially early on, they were like, oh, you're a photographer? Great, we also want you to do that. And so I ended up actually being a paid photographer for the UN, for the US government, all these things through like a back door. But yeah, I had to make that trade-off early on. Yeah.
The next question I had was, so you've had a wide range of experiences with what you've done for work from college and onward. And I was wondering, what would you say was the hardest challenge you faced through that process in all your experiences? Or is there like a time of particular challenge that sticks out to you that you've overcome?
That's a good question. So there's challenges I've faced in terms of how I think about my own career and decisions I make. With lots of challenges faced within roles, but I think that's kind of more interesting. And that hardest one was I got really lucky and got a job in the Obama administration as my first job out of college, and that's because I worked on the campaign, but also just got lucky and met the right people. And then 5 years into that, I left and resigned from the administration because honestly, I was just excited for a new adventure. And I ended up starting as a volunteer for the UN, getting paid $1,500 a month. And I got paid much better than that working for the administration, to move to Sierra Leone and volunteer. And every single person told me I was an idiot for doing that. But it was just one of those career moments where I kind of knew I needed a change despite the risk. In hindsight, it was the best thing I've ever done. I think it's opened up a lot of doors for me. It literally got me my grad school scholarship, that one experience, so things like that. But that was a very nerve-wracking decision that I had to make in terms of my professional choices, at least.
Are there any specific campaigns that the Asian Society has been involved in that you are really proud of?
So I'll be clear, we don't get involved with political campaigns as a nonprofit that is nonpartisan. We, in 2000, because of the rise in anti-Asian violence, made it a kind of recurring major campaign of ours to kind of advocate for that issue. Since then, we've been trying to make sure that, like, anytime we speak out on any big issue or impacting the community, that we always try to mobilize in some way. And so I've been really proud, actually, of the fact that now, starting with that, what can we do here to help the Asian American community in 2020 to where we are now? Now, every time we address an issue, it comes with, one, some level of donation from us as a large nonprofit, but two, we use our kind of fundraising capabilities for those causes. So just two really big ones more recently, we're able to raise several $1,000s from the Monterey Park Shooting Victims Fund. And then more recently, the earthquakes in Syria and Turkey. So in terms of campaigns, we've kind of developed this new way to have impact through our kind of cause campaigns. I don't know if that's what you meant by the question. It might be that, like, what's a brand campaign you've launched? And happy to answer that question too, but that's how I interpreted the question.
I meant it as like any campaign overall. I didn't mean it as like political. I wasn't trying to like specify anything.
Okay. Let me know if that's a good answer then. Yeah.
It was. Thank you.
Through your career, have you ever felt disadvantaged to being Asian? And like, has that ever affected your career? And how did you overcome those challenges if you did face them?
It's a really interesting question. I think, if I'm being totally honest, thinking specifically about my career, I think Asians have an interesting, Asian Americans have a very interesting professional, I don't know what the right is, dilemma. I think in many ways, Asians are overrepresented, right? And I don't want to say overrepresented, like there should be fewer Asians, but like Asians, like achieve lots of professional success, and there's that stereotype, and I think it can often be a harmful stereotype. But I found that I've actually benefited greatly from being Asian in a lot of work circumstances. One thing that I think is really true is, like, in professional situations, you thrive by being competent or seeming competent and seeming warm. And there was an interesting study I read once that Asians generally, and especially Asian men, tend to come off as highly competent even when you're not, which again gets to that Asian model minority stereotype, which is really problematic for lots of reasons. But if I think I'm being honest, I think I have benefited from people assuming competence in me, and I have not benefited from people assuming lack of warmth, as people tend to do in Asians. And that's also who I am. I think I'm like smarter than I am nice. But like, that's been the both positive and negative. In general, though, I think it's important to remember, oftentimes I'm asked, like, what is like being a person of color in the workplace? I'm like, it's really different depending on what color you are. And Asians, especially in the worlds I've worked in, are often well represented, and we should use that privilege to make it even more diverse.
Do you think that the portrayal of Asians in media and Hollywood have improved over the years, from the film Ghost in the Shell to Crazy Rich Asians?
Yeah.
If not, what do you think the media still needs to correct?
Absolutely, it's gotten better. Obviously, like, I was just in a call today about the Oscar nominations of all of the amazing Asian talent, Asian film creators. There's also the SAG Awards. I think there's some wins there. We are hosting a film screening of movies from Asia nominated for Oscar shorts. It is clearly better. And, like, you look at the major, like, even in digital media, like content creation is getting more diverse, things like that. That being said, there's obviously, looking at the data from the TAF study, there's huge way to go But I think the bigger problem is really the harmful representation. Yes, there's a lack of representation, but I think, and this is true for, I think, every minority group, not just racial groups, but every minority group. Media tends to portray stereotypes, and I think that's a problem that still needs to be addressed for Asians.
I'd like to ask, with the advent of social media and digital platforms such as aggregators of news, how has this continued the unfortunate trends of erasure, misrepresentation, and stoking anti-Asian sentiment on one hand, and then if you can follow up about some of the opportunities for self-representation and self-advocacy among the diversity that is under the umbrella Asian or Asian America. So what are some of the unfortunate trends, and what are some of the opportunities that our social media age is creating?
Yeah, I think there's a lot more opportunities than problems. I think especially, and again, my frame is thinking from 2020 to now, when the emergence of, or the rise in Asian hate happened, we've seen the emergence of all sorts of content aggregators in particular sprout up, really targeted, focused on appealing to the Asian community, and doing so in a way that's like unabashed and incredibly celebratory. And that started, though, and some really good ones that I'll shout out are Next Shark and Gold House. There's also a great series of accounts I love called, I think it's like MAAZN Sports, like celebrating Asians in sports, which is such a interesting area. But the one I think is most interesting is Next Shark, because it is a content aggregator ecosystem that came about to make sure when Asians were being attacked, when these attacks were happening in the streets, that it was recorded and it was publicized. And that became one of the major ways the community started to see this sort of stuff. So at first, they did a really good job of addressing the problem of, you know, these crimes are happening without anyone seeing. And finally, people were seeing them, and they were seeing them because they were being really widely shared within the Asian community, and that spread out. And that was a huge sea change. But now those content aggregators have really started to broaden to celebrating Asian culture, which is huge, and like where we need to go, right? Focusing on the negative only gets you so far, but kind of pivoting to being these huge things for Asians by Asians has been a really good outcome and a silver lining from the rise in violence. Yeah.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question. As we, or as many of our audience members may know, speaking about Asian Americans as part of the 1960s, civil rights protest movements, and the ways in which speaking of oneself as Asian American or Asian in the United States is a pan-ethnic term. What do you see in these spaces with regard to building a pan-ethnic sense of identity, as well as allowing individuals to celebrate their more specific national and even within national cultural identities? A little bit more about what's happening in the space from those perspectives would be informative.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You know, anytime I'm talking to other people who are Asian, I never call myself Asian. I don't consider myself Asian. I consider myself Indian or brown. Desi is a term that South Asians use to refer to themselves. And I think that's a really interesting point that I don't think very Asians who identify with the term Asian American, because there's so much diversity within it. And especially when you think about South Asians versus East Asians, I think both South Asians and East Asians would tell you South Asians aren't Asian. And so there's this obvious problem you have when you have a continent of over half the people in the world who are now making up kind of a diaspora group. At the same time, I think the Asian immigrant experience is so similar in so many ways that I think there's a unifying aspect there. And so I think that's the opportunity of a lot of our immigrant experience. And I think a lot of the experience with discrimination, right? Like the rise in anti-Asian hate in the last couple of years is pretty similar to what me and my family and others I know experienced after 9/11 in terms of this, like, the sources are different, but I think there's a lot of empathy within. But I don't know, you ask someone else who's Asian, they're like, yeah, I relate, or someone else who's Indian, and they tell you they relate to someone who's Chinese as much as they relate to someone who's white or black. And so I do think we have to be really careful with kind of breaking down the specific, the demographic diversity there. And also, if I could make one other point, I think we often talk about affirmative action and how it kind of pits the Asian community as the ones, whatever, versus others. The Asian community is, again, model minority stereotyped as being full of mathletes and people who do well on the SATs. But, if you talk to Bangladeshi Americans or so many other groups, they immigrate and they're some of the poorest and least educated groups, and kind of lumped together with these people coming that are going to be tech CEOs. So there's just so much nuance within it that I think, while there is this aspect of coming together around the shared immigrant experience and shared kind of discrimination experience, mostly it's not useful.
Thank you.
My next question was, as your career progressed, you covered this a little bit earlier, but as you went through your career, did you ever have the goal of taking on more of a leadership role and helping within the Asian community, like what you have now with the Asia Society, or did that just happen more organically as you went on?
The first time I thought about it was thinking about what I would do next after the Biden campaign, and thought, okay, well, is there a path for me one day within this? I realized pretty concretely that progressive politics, kind of where I rose up in my career, because Asians are such a small percentage of the electorate, kind of dismiss Asian issues as mattering. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done there. And I thought, okay, one day maybe I can work to do that. And I think my job now gets to that to some degree. But it was just something that I thought would be cool one day. Generally, I try to plan my career as little as possible, and that's worked out the best for me. It's about taking opportunities that are interesting, and good opportunities. So no, there's not much trying to plan out what's next.
What advice would you give to Asians and other minorities working to find their voices online and in the workforce?
That's interesting. Hard to find their voices online. I would say remember that through like owned media, through things like social media, you are speaking to the world. And so Asians have the biggest advantage because Asians are the largest population. And so like what's been a really interesting trend, especially when you think about things like TikTok, which are more Asian in terms of obviously the origin of TikTok, but also the content creators there, is like Asian content creators do better than white content creators because there's more Asians on TikTok. And so one, things are changing, and like you should take advantage of that. I also see younger Asian content creators like own the fact more that they're their ethnic origin more, and that works for them. That's not something that was like cool when I was in school. So it's changing and getting better. And like, I think there's, business advantages to being Asian now, and that's real, and like lean in. In the workplace, I think it's tougher, right? I think it really comes down to the fact that Asians are both cursed and benefit from these model minority stereotypes. So like the biggest thing is, one, don't be ashamed about taking advantage of the fact that you're Asian and people think you're really smart and competent, because they do. Like you are probably smart and competent, but then also Asians really do have more privilege than especially Black and Latino and Indigenous people in the workplace. And as an Asian man, like definitely more privileged than pretty much any, I would say, woman in the workplace. And so it's about like noting that privilege and also using it. Like Asians don't have a lot of privilege in other aspects of society, but this is one where we do. And so it's like, recognize, don't be embarrassed about, you know, leaning into it, but then like benefit others with it.
The next one we had was, who are some people or inspirations that you look up to in your work?
That's tough. My work is interesting. My work is to be, like I said, like I'm essentially a digital director. And so I don't know if there's, I think there's, I would actually cite those content aggregators. Those are ones I cite in lots of presentations and lots of internal meetings and external meetings. Next Shark, Goldhouse in particular are folks doing kind of solving this problem best about how do you increase representation of Asians in media, and specifically the media that matters, like meeting people where they are, like social content. And yeah, we model a lot of our content creation off of them, and we try to work with them a lot.
Sorry. What challenges do you face in your creative process on like a daily, weekly, yearly basis? What keeps you going and motivated in your work?
What keeps me going and motivated? I have found it hard to stay motivated in jobs where I can't see the impact clearly. And so the nonprofit world, that's pretty easy. I think we have huge impact. In working in politics and government, it was incredibly easy. We won or we lost. I really need that to stay motivated at work if I'm not seeing the impact. And it doesn't have to be like, oh, you're changing the world, but like, does the work you do matter, and do you like how it matters? And can you see and feel it? And that's critical for me.
What can we as students, and specifically digital media students, do to help combat anti-Asian messaging online?
Specifically as digital media students, I mean, so much of it is, you know, thinking about how I think videos and content of Asian hate started being seen is because Asians were sharing it themselves, and that shouldn't be true. So if you think about you as people who have, one, either the ability to create digital media or have these platforms, because maybe you do have a following, it's about, you know, can you be using that voice or that content creation skill to lend to this issue? I think being really mindful as you go about your careers of dismantling the harmful stereotypes when you are casting people in content one day. Yeah, make sure it's diverse, but also, you know, don't say stuff about, you know, Asians that's offensive. I think I worry a lot less about Gen Z. I think it's just a problem that exists more with older people, but yeah, I think it's so much of that, like, how are we being thoughtful about content creation and digital media, and then like how are we lending our voice? Because inevitably, whether you have that platform now or you'll be building it and or managing it for others one day, like that comes with a lot of responsibility. So use it for good.
As a follow-up to that, like you were just talking about how much of that hate comes from like a more older generation, and do you think using digital media can help change people's attitudes that way, or do you think that's something that just kind of needs to die off for lack of a better word?
I think it can. I think the biggest thing people don't or often forget is like everyone's on social media. It doesn't matter if you're young or old at this point, everyone is. Might be different platforms, you may see different stuff. And everyone is really scrolling through the same kinds of content. It is short video and it is like graphics. And I'd say younger people are actually better at discerning, oh, this is bullshit or this is driving an agenda or something like that than people my parents' age. They see what they see and they run with it. And so, yeah, I think content can have a huge impact on shaping hearts and minds for every generation.
As a last question from us, what would your advice be for students, particularly those who are graduating this year? What would your advice be for students graduating this year who are planning to enter the digital media work field?
So for me, when I joined, and I, of course, was backed into it a bit, but when I joined, it was a very different landscape where well, maybe not different. When I joined, the landscape was, oh, if you're young, you will be good at this. You get it. Well, that's changed to some degree. And while I think the people who are like running digital media are now probably my age or their mid-30s or even older, I think there's still so like the amount of talent and ability and like speed and expertise at which young people, like literally all young people your age, can create content relative to someone who's like a 35-year-old video editor is your strategic advantage. Like, be nimble and like demonstrate that you are like digital media experts who understand that digital media changes constantly and you can adapt with it, because that's the big difference between, I think, your generation and mine, which is, oh, you get digital media and we get that digital media, this one thing. It is like tweets, it's social, it's something explicit, but it's like constantly changing. And I think like that's the biggest advantage. And like you can be one person creators in a way that I think wasn't possible 5 years ago. And I think that is like the way to unlock opportunity, like be one person creation team.
Speaking of one person creation teams, having worked in the nonprofit fields myself, and you mentioned how large your team was when you were involved in the political campaigns. Can you say a little bit about your current role and the size of either your full-time team or some of the configurations of your collaborations? As you know, there's a difference when we move into the nonprofit sector. So what do your team size and configurations look like? Who are you collaborating with?
Yeah. So on the the Biden campaign, I had a video. So I managed 7 different teams, but the video team was the biggest, and it was 50 video editors, producers, animators, motion graphics people, like write every piece of the process. Here I have a video team of 2 people. To give you some idea of the difference between a political campaign and a nonprofit. So my team here is 15 people, and we manage every aspect of communications and marketing, from press and traditional media to advertising to video and content creation to design, managing our website and doing the development work there, running our social platforms, managing email marketing. What else? Those are the buckets. Those are the that's what we do. And those are like, in my mind, 7 or 8 different functions that should each have a team. But the nonprofit world, you don't get that. And so you have to be super scrappy, but also we do a lot less, quite honestly. Nonprofits, it's a world where things are slower and you do less, and the impact you have is less than a world like a campaign. That's a reality. But it makes the problem solving, I think, a lot more interesting. You ask who my biggest collaborators with are at work. Aside from my team, who kind of represent functions and everything I just outlined, it's the development team, so our fundraising team and the chief development officer. In any nonprofit, the marketing and communications team works hand in hand with the development team. And aside from that, yeah, the whole management team in general, but development comes first. So yeah, much smaller team here than I'm used to, but it makes it fun.
And following up on the different nature of the nonprofit world, where certainly, as in any social media and digital communications environment, one is measuring numbers, particularly in the nonprofit field, whether it's grant-funded work or audience outreach and building or fundraising. There's also the desire to have a sense of qualitative or emotional impact. How, now that you've come on board, does your team think about having those impacts, and how to measure or show that you're having impacts along those lines?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to be honest, we don't do a good job of measuring those impacts. We have them, but how we show them is
Kind
really
of an emerging thing. So I think I was hoping to find out you were on the leading edge and we're going to enlighten us all.
I wish. No, it's a critical part of what we do. You know, we are a nonprofit. Most of our money comes from either other nonprofits or other individual donors. And a big part of why those people donate is to hear about that qualitative impact. Who are the people we're touching, and what are the lives we're changing? It's really just through finding those stories through our impact. So if we are, you know, launching a new campaign to highlight Asian American singers, let's say, let's spend some time to kind of meeting with the little girl who's inspired by the content we made and now wants to be a singer too, and telling that story. We don't do enough of that. That's kind of critical to what we do. In addition to that, of course, there's the qualitative measurement of how many people are reaching, things like that we do on a regular basis, but got to have both when that's how your money's made. But no secrets, sadly.
Thank you. Yes, it's one of those difficult problems to crack. So I think we'll all be working on that for a while. Heather, I saw that you had a question. Did you want to bring that to the table?
Sure, or anyone else can ask it too. But I was really interested in, Aalok, how you spoke about at the beginning, how the Asia Society's mission had changed from being sort of a founding goal of sort of informing white people about Asia, and is now changed and transformed into celebrating Asian people and becoming a platform to stop Asian hate. So can you talk a little bit about that transformation? What was it like to be a part of that? And what were some of the big changes that you had to make to realize a big impact? And also, because it's a long question, also about how it changed the audience and like, what was the impact of that? Because I imagine those things would be kind of related.
Yeah. So first, I would say more than a change, it's an expansion. So we never lost our core mission of kind of educating the West about Asia and vice versa. We largely do that with our policy work. I think that's where it's most relevant, of kind of what are the policy happening in Asia, and that's really interesting to the American audience and vice versa. But when we do more of the cultural work, when we do more of the arts focused work, when we're telling stories about Asians and the Asian diaspora, that is much less about communicating Asia to the West and vice versa. And that is much more about celebrating Asians. That change really started in earnest in 2020 with the shift from rising Asian hate. And so while I started after that kind of not pivot, but expansion, increase of this other pillar, that effort was underway, a lot of the work is happening now. And to answer the second part of your question, it's really expanding our audience opportunity. So we've really had this audience of people who are really interested in Asia because through a policy lens or an arts lens, it's really given us a platform and a opportunity to talk to more Asian Americans and to also engage in more less, not less serious, but like more pop culture issues, things like food, things like movies, content topics that resonate more with Asian Americans. And it's been great for our audience expansion. So that's really critical to us. And yeah, it's nothing but an opportunity.
Perhaps as a final question, as someone coming into a new position, particularly in a leadership role, that is a transition not only for you as the new person, but also for the team. What are some of the ways, having come into different positions in a leadership role, that you've found help smooth the transition for you into the role and for the team with you as a new leader?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The two things I think I've found have consistently been helpful are listen really, really well to everyone, right? Like spend your early time learning and listening, and show that you actually are listening. Don't assume anything. And the second is work harder than everyone else. I think especially as a new leader in particular, not you have to show that you are kind of putting in, you're at least willing to put in more than the folks you're managing. You have to win early credibility, and there's no better way to do that. Now, I can think of plenty of good counter arguments to doing that. Like, you don't want to set an example of working all that time, but really it's about just show that you are in it, you're there, and you're not going to come in and assume you know how to do everything and call the shots. That's the last thing anyone ever wants to see. So pretty obvious stuff, but I think worth repeating.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Any questions? Anybody out there in the YouTube live world? Feel free to type your questions in the chat if you've got any. Anyone?
I'll ask, I keep saying it's the final question.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that, although I was aware of the Asia Society and particularly the museum in New York City, I was less aware until meeting you of its global offices and presence. How is that for you from a coordination standpoint, coordinating across multiple time zones, multiple languages, and with multiple teams and multiple leaders? How does that present?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say it makes things challenging at times, but we have, Asia Society is structured in a way, we have 15 centers around the world. We're structured in a way that our centers operate really independently. And that's intentional for a number of reasons. But I think the most important is that that's how you best capture that local perspective, to have centers kind of thinking about what's really important to them, their own communities, their own diasporas, things like that. Operationally, it makes things hard. It means one center might be running in one direction, one center might be running in the other, but that kind of messiness, I think, is really, really important. Sometimes we'll have two centers trying to develop the same programming, and yeah, that's not maybe ideal from a global perspective, but again, it shows there's a lot of demand for that, and there's a lot of demand in these two areas. So our centers really operate on their own, and we as a central headquarters then try to uplift the best of and try to shape this global brand based on what we're getting from across rather than micromanaging too much. But yeah, it's messy, but it works.
All right. Well, I think this is a good time on that note to wrap things up. This conversation has been incredibly informative and inspirational. Thank you, Aalok, for sharing your insight, and thanks to our co-hosts, Caleb and Mari and Clarissa, for moderating. Everyone is invited to join us for our second event in this year's Diverse Perspective series on Monday, March 20th at 5:30 Eastern Time, when we welcome UI UX designer and UConn DMD alum, Andrew Wolf. Check out the entire rich lineup in our Diverse Perspectives in Digital Media and Design 2023 speaker series at dmd.uconn.edu/diverse. And do not forget to subscribe to our YouTube page so that you can get those notifications as well. And also follow us on social media at UConn DMD to see all of our department's great content. Thanks to our students and everyone who worked together to produce this event. And most of all, thank you to all of our virtual audience out there for joining us today. I hope you are all as inspired about Aalok's insight as we are inside this Zoom room tonight. There is a ton of work to be done, but if we can continue to inspire and mentor our young creatives out there together, we can change this digital world for the better. Thanks again and have a great night. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
All right. We're out. Okay.